The story of the Mamluks is one of paradox and complexity, blending elements of slavery, military prowess, political genius, and brutal dominance. To understand the fate of Christian women under their rule, one must first grasp the origins and rise of the Mamluk Sultanate, a story that begins not with rulers but with slaves. The word Mamluk itself derives from the Arabic Mamluk, meaning owned or possessed, a term that underscores the paradoxical nature of their society. Men who began life as slaves would eventually control empires. The Mamluks were originally a class of slave soldiers, primarily of Turkic and Circassian origin, imported from the steppes of Central Asia and the Caucasus. Young boys, often captured or purchased from their homelands, were brought to Egypt and Syria, converted to Islam, and rigorously trained in military arts. This system, initiated by the Ayyubid dynasty, was intended to create an elite fighting force that was loyal only to its master, detached from local politics and tribal loyalties. However, this system inadvertently laid the foundation for one of the most powerful dynasties in the Islamic world. The transition from slave to sovereign is one of the most remarkable features of Mamluk history. In 1250, following the death of the Ayyubid Sultan As-Salih Ayyub, a group of these Mamluk soldiers seized power in Egypt. They overthrew the weak leadership that succeeded him and established the Mamluk Sultanate, which would endure for more than 2.5 centuries. Their rise was not merely a military coup. It was a sophisticated takeover that relied on a combination of martial skill, political acumen, and exploitation of societal divisions. The Mamluk regime was divided into 2 major periods: the Bahri Mamluks, primarily of Turkic origin, ruling from 1250 to 1382, and the Burji Mamluks, predominantly Circassian, ruling from 1382 until the Ottoman conquest in 1517. The Bahri period was characterized by consolidation of power, military campaigns, and establishing Cairo as a political and cultural center. The Burji period, while similarly militaristic, saw increased internal strife, palace intrigues, and more frequent upheavals. In both periods, the essential features of Mamluk rule, a rigid military hierarchy, reliance on slave soldiers, and a strong connection between military prowess and political authority, remained constant. One of the key elements of the Mamluk rise was their unrivaled military capability. The Mamluks were trained from boyhood to become disciplined, loyal, and deadly warriors. They excelled in cavalry tactics, archery, and close combat, and their military organization allowed them to mobilize rapidly and dominate both internal and external threats. Perhaps their most famous achievement was their victory over the Mongols at the Battle of Untold in 1260. Facing an invasion force that had devastated much of the Muslim world, the Mamluks demonstrated not only strategic brilliance, but also the effectiveness of their unique military structure. This victory secured their reputation as defenders of the Islamic world and solidified their legitimacy in the eyes of both Muslim and non-Muslim populations. Yet, military strength was only part of the Mamluk strategy for power. Their governance was marked by pragmatism and ruthlessness in equal measure. Unlike other dynasties that relied heavily on hereditary rule, the Mamluks depended on merit, loyalty, and the ability to command forces. Leaders were often chosen from within the ranks of senior Mamluks, creating a system that encouraged loyalty but also bred constant political tension. Intrigue, assassinations, and sudden purges were commonplace, ensuring that no ruler could feel entirely secure. This volatile political environment had profound consequences for the general population, especially minority communities such as Christians and Jews, whose protection often depended entirely on the whims and priorities of the reigning sultan. The Mamluk economy was closely intertwined with their military system. The state controlled trade routes, collected taxes, and oversaw agricultural production, with a significant portion of revenue dedicated to sustaining the military elite. Cairo became a bustling hub of commerce, culture, and religion, attracting merchants from Europe, Africa, and Asia. The city's architectural and cultural achievements, including grand mosques, schools, and caravanserais, reflected the wealth and ambition of the Mamluk rulers. However, beneath this veneer of sophistication lay a society structured on rigid hierarchies and social control, where non-Muslims were often marginalized, and women, particularly from minority communities, were subject to exploitation and violence. The treatment of non-Muslims in Mamluk society was shaped by a combination of Islamic legal principles, political pragmatism, and social hierarchy. Christians and Jews were recognized as dhimmi, or protected peoples, under Islamic law, which theoretically guaranteed their right to practice their religion and live without persecution. In practice, however, these protections were fragile. Christians were often subject to higher taxes, restrictions on public worship, and limited access to positions of power. Women, especially, bore the brunt of these limitations. As Mamluks solidified control over Egypt and Syria, Christian women became particularly vulnerable to abduction, sexual exploitation, and forced conversion, a tragic consequence of the intersection between political authority, military dominance, and gendered vulnerability. The very system that elevated the Mamluks also contributed to an environment in which violence against minority populations could flourish. The Mamluks' origin as slave soldiers meant that they were accustomed to a hierarchical, authoritarian structure where obedience and dominance were paramount. Their worldview often equated strength with legitimacy, and those outside their immediate circle of power, particularly non-Muslim women, were frequently treated as objects of conquest or tools of political leverage. Historical chronicles and accounts from travelers and diplomats describe instances of abduction, forced labor, and sexual exploitation, suggesting that the rise of the Mamluks brought not only military glory but also widespread human suffering for those who lacked the protection of wealth, influence, or religious authority. The Mamluk approach to governance and social control also had a long-lasting cultural impact. They established a martial aristocracy, a political system based on loyalty and strength rather than inheritance, and a society in which religious and ethnic minorities were constantly reminded of their subordinate status. Christian women, in particular, became emblematic of the Mamluks' power over both body and society, often facing pressures to convert, marry, or serve in ways that reinforced the ruling elite's dominance. The legacy of this period is complex. While the Mamluks are celebrated for their military victories and architectural achievements, the human cost, especially for women and minority communities, was immense. In conclusion, the rise of the Mamluks was a story of paradox, from slaves to rulers, from outsiders to sovereigns, from disciplined warriors to feared overlords. Their ascent reshaped the political, social, and cultural landscape of Egypt and Syria, creating a state renowned for military might, architectural grandeur, and administrative sophistication. Yet beneath this veneer of strength and order lay a harsh reality for those outside the elite ranks, particularly Christian women, whose lives were profoundly affected by the mechanisms of power, exploitation, and violence inherent in Mamluk rule. Understanding this rise provides crucial context for the atrocities and systemic abuses that would define the experience of women under their dominion. A dark chapter in the history of a society celebrated for its power, yet marred by oppression. To fully comprehend the precarious position of Christian women in Mamluk society, it is essential to examine the social, religious, and political frameworks that defined their lives. The Mamluk Sultanate, ruling Egypt and Syria from 1250 to 1517, was a military state built upon power, loyalty, and domination. Within this structure, Christian communities existed as minorities under the system of dhimmi, which theoretically granted protection but in reality offered only conditional safety. For women, especially, these protections were tenuous at best. Their vulnerability was not merely incidental, it was a consequence of the intersection between gender, religion, and the political priorities of a militarized state. Christianity in Egypt and the Levant predated the Mamluks by centuries. Communities of Copts, Syriacs and other Eastern Christians lived in towns, villages and major cities, maintaining churches, monasteries and their own religious hierarchies. While they were permitted to practice their faith under Islamic law, these rights were always circumscribed by regulations intended to reinforce Muslim dominance. Christians paid the jizya, a tax levied on non-Muslim men, and were restricted in certain public and legal capacities. Women, however, were particularly exposed because they could not wield political authority. Their movements were often subject to social scrutiny, and their physical presence became a symbol of both social status and religious identity. The vulnerability of Christian women under Mamluk rule can be understood in terms of multiple layers of risk: legal, social, and physical. Legally, they were under the protection of the state only insofar as their families or communities could pay taxes and adhere to the rules imposed by Muslim authorities. Socially, women were constrained by norms that emphasized modesty, obedience, and seclusion. These norms, intended to protect women, paradoxically increased their vulnerability. In a society where male honor and authority were paramount, women's bodies became sites of both control and contention. Mamluk rulers and officials, often far removed from accountability, could exploit these conditions to assert dominance or exact tribute. The physical risks Christian women faced were stark. Historical accounts describe the frequent abductions and forced conversions of women during military campaigns and raids, particularly in frontier regions and areas where Mamluk control was contested. These raids were not random acts of violence, but were part of a system in which the capture of women could serve multiple purposes: enriching the captor, destabilizing Christian communities, or demonstrating the supremacy of the Mamluk state. Women were often taken to serve in elite households, harems, or as concubines, where their autonomy was entirely stripped away. Even those who were not directly enslaved lived under the constant threat of such raids, which forced families to adopt restrictive practices to protect their daughters and wives beyond the battle. Christian women were also vulnerable in urban and rural settings. In cities like Cairo, Alexandria, and Damascus, the Mamluks maintained a highly stratified society in which elite households wielded enormous power. Wealthy Christian families might provide protection for their women through status, connections, or bribes, but the average woman had little recourse against the authority of a Mamluk official. Reports from contemporary chroniclers suggest that women could be coerced into marriage or sexual servitude, sometimes under the guise of religious conversion. In rural areas, Christian villages faced similar pressures. Women could be kidnapped during local conflicts, conscripted into labor, or subjected to arbitrary violence by military detachments passing through their region. Religious identity played a crucial role in the vulnerability of Christian women. The Mamluk state, while pragmatic, was deeply intertwined with Sunni Islam. Conversion to Islam was both a tool of political consolidation and an expression of religious dominance. Christian women were often pressured to abandon their faith, whether through direct coercion or as a condition of protection. Those who resisted faced severe consequences, ranging from social ostracism to outright violence. Even in cases where conversion was voluntary, it was rarely a matter of personal faith. Instead, it reflected a survival strategy within a society structured to favor Muslim dominance and punish deviation. The vulnerability of Christian women was compounded by economic pressures. Many Christian households relied on agriculture, trade, or artisan work for survival, and their resources were often limited by heavy taxation and the demands of local authorities. In times of economic strain or political instability, women became especially susceptible to exploitation. Families might be forced to sell daughters, or allow them to enter marriages arranged under duress, while wealthier women could be pressured into offering themselves to powerful patrons or officials to secure family protection. In this sense, The intersection of poverty, minority status, and gender created a cycle of vulnerability that was difficult to escape. Mamluk chroniclers and foreign travelers provide a window into the lived experience of Christian women, offering glimpses of fear, resilience, and survival strategies. Accounts from European pilgrims and merchants visiting Cairo describe women veiled and secluded, yet always aware of the omnipresent threat of violence. Local Christian traditions speak of families hiding daughters in monasteries or remote villages to avoid abduction. Stories of women who resisted conversion or attempted to escape captivity often ended tragically, highlighting both their courage and the brutality of the system in which they lived. These narratives, while fragmentary, underscore the daily precariousness of life for Christian women under Mamluk rule. It is also important to consider the broader social implications of these vulnerabilities. The abduction or coercion of women had a ripple effect on entire Christian communities. Marriages were disrupted, family lines endangered, and social cohesion undermined. The threat of losing daughters to forced conversion or enslavement created a climate of fear that shaped community practices, from stricter supervision of young women to the reinforcement of patriarchal authority. In many cases, these measures provided only limited protection, leaving women still exposed to the arbitrary power of the Mamluk elite. Despite the dangers, Christian women exhibited remarkable resilience and agency. Some found ways to negotiate their survival, leveraging familial networks, religious institutions, or economic resources to reduce risk. Monastery. IES and convents sometimes served as refuges, offering sanctuary to women fleeing abduction or coercion. Women in elite families could occasionally use influence or negotiation to secure the release of captives. Yet even these strategies were fragile, dependent on the goodwill of powerful individuals or the shifting tides of political authority. In summary, the vulnerability of Christian women under Mamluk rule was systemic and multifaceted. It was rooted in legal and social hierarchies, reinforced by religious dominance, and exacerbated by economic and political pressures. Women were exposed to abduction, forced conversion, sexual exploitation, and social marginalization. Their experiences were shaped by the interplay of gender, faith, and the militarized structure of Mamluk society. Understanding this vulnerability is essential to comprehending the broader social dynamics of the period and the profound human cost of the Mamluk rise to power. The story of Christian women under Mamluk rule is, therefore, not only one of oppression, but also one of resilience and survival in the face of systemic violence. Their plight illuminates the darker side of a society celebrated for its military victories and architectural achievements, a society in which power was maintained through coercion and where women, particularly minority women, bore the heaviest burdens of its structure. The Mamluk period in Egypt and Syria was defined not only by military might and political control, but also by a systematic and deeply entrenched exploitation of marginalized communities. Among the most vulnerable were Christian women, who, due to their gender, religious identity, and social status, were disproportionately subjected to abduction, enslavement, and exploitation. These practices were not occasional acts of violence, but often reflected an organized system that reinforced the power and dominance. And the Mamluk elite. The human toll of this system was immense, shaping lives and communities for generations. Abduction was one of the primary mechanisms by which Christian women were subjected to exploitation under Mamluk rule. Military campaigns, particularly those along contested borders or in rebellious regions, provided ample opportunity for Mamluk forces to seize captives. Young women were considered particularly valuable because they could be assimilated into households, sold in markets, or used as instruments of religious and social dominance. Historical chronicles describe raids on Christian villages, monasteries, and towns where women were taken in large numbers, often with little resistance possible due to the overwhelming force of Mamluk cavalry. These abductions were brutal, leaving entire communities traumatized and destabilized. The practice of taking women during raids served multiple purposes for the Mamluk elite. Firstly, it reinforced the power and status of the ruling class. Owning and controlling women, especially from minority communities, was a visible assertion of dominance, reflecting the hierarchical nature of Mamluk society. Secondly, abductions often served as economic transactions. Women captured during raids could be sold in slave markets, generating substantial revenue for both military leaders and the state treasury. Prices varied according to age, appearance and skills, but even the least valuable women were often subject to forced labor or domestic servitude, illustrating the commodification of human life that underpinned the Mamluk system. Enslavement extended beyond the battlefield and into everyday society. Christian women, particularly those in urban centers, could be coerced into domestic service or consigned to elite households. The Mamluks maintained a hierarchical social order in which household slavery was a central institution. Within these households, women were tasked with domestic labor, often including cooking, cleaning, and child-rearing. However, many were also exploited sexually, serving as concubines or forced wives for powerful officials. The line between domestic servitude and sexual exploitation was often blurred, and women had little recourse, as the legal system prioritized the property rights of their captors over the personal autonomy of the enslaved. The Mamluks' control over Christian women was not limited to physical domination, it extended into psychological and social spheres as well. Enslaved women were stripped of their previous identities, including names, religious practices, and social connections. Forced conversion to Islam was a common strategy, intended to erase the women's prior identity and integrate them into Muslim households. Those who resisted faced severe punishment, ranging from beatings to social ostracism, and were often branded as disobedient or rebellious, which could justify further abuse. The psychological trauma of these experiences, compounded by isolation and the loss of familial support, created profound and lasting scars. Sexual exploitation was an especially insidious aspect of Mamluk control. Concubinage and forced sexual relationships were institutionalized in elite households, where women could be treated as both objects of desire and symbols of power. Women from Christian communities were particularly targeted because their non-Muslim status made them other and easier to control. Elite Mamluks often took pride in displaying their ability to possess women from these communities, reinforcing social hierarchies and instilling fear within minority populations. Such practices were not hidden, but were normalized within Mamluk society, reflecting both the gendered and religious dimensions of power. Economic factors also played a role in the exploitation of Christian women. Families in Christian communities often faced heavy taxation, social restrictions, and limited access to wealth. When daughters were abducted, families were sometimes forced to pay ransoms for their release. In other cases, the abduction of a woman could serve as leverage to extract political or economic concessions from the broader community. This system of exploitation created cycles of vulnerability, where women became both symbols of power and tools of economic extraction, leaving families in constant fear and communities destabilized. The impact of these abductions and exploitative practices extended beyond individual women to the social fabric of Christian communities. Entire communities could be destabilized by repeated raids or the loss of women, who were often central to family structures and social continuity. Monastic and religious institutions sometimes became temporary refuges, attempting to protect women from abduction, but their efforts were limited by the pervasive power of the Mamluks and the constant threat of force. Social cohesion suffered as fear permeated daily life, leading to stricter oversight of women and reinforcing patriarchal control within minority communities. Historical records and eyewitness accounts provide insight into the scale and nature of these practices. Chronicles from Mamluk historians, though often written from the perspective of the ruling elite, document raids, abductions, and the integration of Christian women into households and markets. European travelers and diplomats also noted the precarious position of minority women, observing the fear and social restrictions imposed to prevent their loss. These accounts reveal not only the systematic nature of abduction and enslavement, but also the normalization of exploitation within Mamluk society. Despite the harsh realities, Christian women displayed remarkable resilience in the face of these abuses. Some were able to negotiate limited freedoms or maintain secret connections with their families and religious communities. Others relied on monasteries, convents, or sympathetic individuals to escape the worst forms of exploitation. However, these strategies were often precarious and temporary, illustrating the immense challenges faced by women who lived under the constant threat of abduction and enslavement. It is important to recognize that the exploitation of Christian women under the Mamluks was not merely an unfortunate byproduct of war or conquest. It was deeply embedded in the social, political, and economic structures of the time. The Mamluk state, built on military power and hierarchical control, relied on the subjugation of minority populations to assert authority and maintain stability. Women, particularly from Christian communities, were uniquely vulnerable due to their intersectional position within society, making them both targets and instruments of state power. In conclusion, the abduction, enslavement, and exploitation of Christian women under Mamluk rule represent one of the darkest aspects of the Sultanate's history. Women were not passive victims but were subjected to systemic abuse that combined physical, psychological, and social domination. These practices reinforced the power of the Mamluk elite, destabilized Christian communities, and left lasting scars on the social fabric of the region. Understanding each reality is essential to appreciating the human cost of Mamluk rule, particularly for minority populations whose suffering was often overshadowed by accounts of military victories and political achievements. The story of these women is one of tragedy, resilience, and survival. It highlights the intersection of gender, religion, and power in a society where authority was maintained through coercion, violence, and exploitation. By examining the systematic nature of abduction and enslavement, we gain a clearer understanding of the lived experiences of Christian women and the broader societal consequences of Mamluk dominance. Their suffering, often invisible in mainstream historical narratives, is a critical lens through which to view the human impact of one of the medieval Middle East most powerful and complex societies. Vulnerability of Christian women under Mamluk rule extended far beyond physical threats such as abduction and enslavement. It encompassed a pervasive system of religious and cultural pressures designed to consolidate Muslim dominance, reinforce societal hierarchies, and control minority populations. These pressures were particularly acute for women, whose bodies and identities became battlegrounds for both political authority and religious supremacy. Understanding these forces is crucial to appreciating the full scope of suffering endured by Christian women during the Mamluk period, as well as the broader social dynamics of the era. At the heart of Mamluk governance was a strong intertwining of state authority and Sunni Islamic religious law. While the Mamluks were pragmatic rulers, often allowing Christian communities to continue practicing their faith, the overarching framework of society emphasized Islamic dominance. Christians were considered dhimmi, a status that theoretically offered protection but came with significant restrictions. The protections promised by dhimmi status were conditional: failure to comply with Islamic regulations, refusal to pay taxes, such as the jizya, or acts deemed disrespectful to Muslim authorities could lead to punishment. For women, these conditions translated into constant scrutiny and a heightened risk of coercion, particularly in matters of religious practice, dress, and public behavior. One of the most profound forms of pressure faced by Christian women was the threat of forced conversion. Conversion to Islam was not always achieved through overt coercion. It could be subtle, insidious, and institutionalized. Women who were abducted or sold into Mamluk households were often presented with an implicit choice: adopt Islam or endure continued subjugation and mistreatment. This pressure was reinforced by social isolation, as women separated from their families and communities often found themselves entirely dependent on their captors. Conversion, in such circumstances, became both a survival strategy and a mechanism for erasing the woman's prior identity. Chroniclers of the time note that even when conversion was nominal or superficial, it had the intended effect of asserting Muslim supremacy and diminishing the presence of Christianity within elite circles. Beyond conversion, Christian women faced social and cultural pressures aimed at controlling their behavior and reinforcing gender hierarchies. Public conduct, dress, and mobility were closely monitored, reflecting a broader concern with regulating female virtue and honor. Women were expected to observe strict standards of modesty, including the wearing of veils and limited interaction with men outside their immediate household. While these norms were ostensibly protective, they functioned as tools of surveillance, restricting autonomy and reinforcing the authority of male-dominated households. For Christian women who were already marginalized by their religious status, these expectations intensified their isolation and vulnerability, making them dependent on the goodwill or coercion of Muslim authorities. Marriage and sexual relationships were another key avenue through which religious and cultural pressures were exerted. Women abducted or coerced into Mamluk households were often forced into marriages or concubinage, frequently with Muslim men. These unions were not only personal violations, but also symbolic instruments of power. By compelling Christian women to marry or serve Muslim men, the Mamluks asserted dominance over both the women themselves and their broader communities. Such practices disrupted family structures, undermined religious continuity, and instilled fear among minority populations, reinforcing the perception that Muslim rulers had ultimate control over the lives of non-Muslim subjects. Religious authorities played a significant role in reinforcing these pressures. Mamluk society was deeply intertwined with the ulema, or Islamic scholars, who interpreted religious law and legitimized state actions. Women who resisted conversion or failed to comply with societal expectations could be subject to legal or extrajudicial penalties, often justified through religious decrees. At the same time, these authorities could provide limited avenues for protection, such as offering sanctuary or advocating on behalf of women in exceptional cases. However, such protections were unreliable and contingent on the favor of powerful individuals, leaving the vast majority of Christian women at the mercy of a system that systematically marginalized and exploited them. Cultural pressures were also evident in the way Christian women were perceived and represented within Mamluk society. Their status as other made them targets of both fascination and prejudice. Women from minority communities were frequently objectified in literature, poetry, and chronicles, emphasizing their exoticism while simultaneously reinforcing their vulnerability. These representations reflected societal attitudes in which Christian women were seen less as autonomous individuals and more as symbols of religious and social hierarchy. Their bodies and identities became instruments through which the ruling elite asserted dominance, projecting power and control over both minority populations and the broader social order. The cumulative effect of these religious and cultural pressures was profound. Christian women were caught between the demands of their faith, the expectations of their families and communities, and the coercive power of the Mamluk state. Many faced impossible choices: submit to conversion or exploitation, remain faithful but risk abduction and social marginalization, or attempt escape at great personal danger. These pressures were not merely episodic but constant, shaping everyday life, dictating movement and behavior, and eroding autonomy. The psychological impact of living under such conditions was immense. as women navigated a society in which survival often required complicity or compromise. Despite these overwhelming pressures, Christian women demonstrated resilience and agency in various ways. Some maintained secret practices of their faith, continuing to pray, observe rituals and educate their children in Christian traditions even within hostile environments. Others leveraged relationships within households, monasteries or local communities to negotiate better treatment or temporary protection. These acts of resistance, while often invisible in official records, reveal the determination of women to preserve their identity and dignity amidst systemic oppression. Nevertheless, the constant threat of coercion and exploitation meant that such agency was limited, precarious, and often temporary. It is also crucial to understand the broader societal consequences of these religious and cultural pressures. The coercion of women disrupted family structures, weakened the transmission of Christian cultural and religious practices, and created a climate of fear within minority communities. Parents adopted strict measures to protect daughters, including limiting education, confining mobility, or relying on monasteries and religious institutions for safeguarding. While these strategies offered some protection, they could not eliminate the structural vulnerabilities that made Christian women targets of abduction, conversion, and exploitation. In conclusion, religious and cultural pressures were central to the Mamluks' control over Christian women. These pressures operated through legal systems, social norms, household practices, and religious authority, creating a pervasive environment of coercion and surveillance. Women were forced to navigate a complex web of threats and expectations, balancing survival against the preservation of identity, faith, and personal dignity. The system reinforced male and Muslim dominance while marginalizing minority populations, with Christian women bearing the greatest burden of these intersecting pressures. The story of Christian women under Mamluk rule is one of both oppression and resilience. While religious and cultural pressures were tools of domination, women continually found ways to resist, survive, and maintain aspects of their identity. Examining these pressures allows us to understand not only the personal experiences of these women, but also the broader social dynamics of Mamluk society. A society celebrated for military victories and architectural splendor, yet deeply marked by control, coercion, and exploitation. The reign of the Mamluks left an indelible mark on the lands they conquered, shaping not only political and economic structures, but also the lives of minority communities in ways that echoed long after the fall of the Sultanate. Among the most affected were Christian women, whose abductions, forced conversions, and systemic exploitation created a legacy of trauma, resilience, and cultural memory. Understanding this legacy requires examining both the immediate consequences of Mamluk rule and the ways in which these events have been remembered, recorded, and interpreted over time. The immediate legacy of Mamluk policies for Christian women was profound. Generations of families lived under a constant shadow of fear, where the abduction or coercion of daughters was a real and ongoing threat. These experiences disrupted family structures, social cohesion, and community continuity. Women who survived abduction or enslavement often returned home permanently changed, physically, emotionally, and spiritually. Their reintegration into Christian communities could be fraught with difficulties, including stigma, suspicion, and the challenge of navigating a society that viewed women both as victims and as bearers of communal honor. For communities that experienced repeated loss of women, the social fabric itself was strained, as families were forced to implement strict protective measures that altered traditional norms of marriage, education, and female mobility. Beyond the immediate social consequences, the Mamluk period created long-term cultural and religious repercussions. The forced conversions of Christian women, whether partial, nominal, or complete, weakened the continuity of Christian practices within affected communities. Children born of such unions, particularly in cases of concubinage or coercive marriage, often occupied ambiguous social and religious positions. Over time, these dynamics contributed to a gradual erosion of cultural identity among minority populations, highlighting the powerful and lasting impact of policies that targeted women as both symbols and instruments of dominance. The perception of Mamluks in historical memory is also shaped by the treatment of Christian women. European observers and travelers, particularly during the late medieval and early modern periods, recorded stories of abduction, exploitation, and forced conversion, emphasizing the suffering of women as evidence of the brutality and tyranny of Mamluk rule. These accounts, while sometimes colored by political and religious bias, created enduring images of Christian women as victims under Muslim rule. These narratives not only influenced European understanding of the Mamluks, but also reinforced broader patterns of intercultural perception, framing the Sultanate as simultaneously powerful, exotic, and morally oppressive. Christian communities within Egypt and Syria preserved memories of these experiences in their own ways. Monasteries, convents, and ecclesiastical records often documented instances of abduction, coercion, and resistance, serving as both historical record and spiritual testament. Stories of women who resisted conversion, protected their faith, or escaped captivity were passed down as exemplars of courage and piety. These accounts reinforced communal identity, reminding future generations of both the dangers faced by women and the resilience required to survive under oppressive conditions. In this way, the legacy of Mamluk oppression became intertwined with religious and cultural memory, influencing social practices, moral narratives, and communal cohesion for centuries. The Mamluk system also left structural legacies that continued to affect Christian women even after the Sultanate's decline. Social hierarchies, legal codes, and gendered norms established under Mamluk rule persisted, shaping the opportunities and vulnerabilities of women in subsequent regimes. For example, during the Ottoman period, Christian women still faced restrictions on dress, public mobility, and legal rights, reflecting the enduring influence of Mamluk social norms. Even when direct political control shifted, the patterns of exploitation, marginalization, and coerced assimilation established under Mamluks continued to shape the experiences of minority women, demonstrating the long-lasting consequences of institutionalized oppression. Historians today have increasingly recognized the importance of examining the experiences of women in understanding the full impact of Mamluk rule. For centuries, historical accounts emphasized military campaigns, architectural achievements, and political intrigue, often marginalizing the experiences of women and minority communities. Modern scholarship, drawing on chronicles, legal documents, travelers' accounts, and oral traditions, has begun to highlight the human cost of Mamluk policies, particularly for Christian women. These studies illuminate not only the scale of abduction, enslavement, and forced conversion, but also the ways in which women navigated, resisted, and survived these oppressive systems. The legacy of Mamluk exploitation also offers broader insights into the mechanisms of power in medieval societies. Christian women were targeted not simply as individuals, but as symbols of communal and religious identity. By controlling women, the Mamluks reinforced hierarchies, asserted dominance, and instilled fear across minority populations. The psychological and social effects of these practices extended far beyond immediate victims, shaping community behavior, gender norms, and interreligious dynamics. Understanding this legacy allows historians to see Mamluk rule not only as a period of military and political achievement, but also as a time when power was exercised through gendered and religiousized forms of control. Importantly, the legacy of these abuses continues to resonate in contemporary memory and scholarship. For Christian communities in Egypt and the Levant, stories of women suffering under the Mamluks are part of a broader narrative of resilience in the face of systemic oppression. These narratives preserve a sense of historical continuity, emphasizing the courage, ingenuity, and faith of women who survived under conditions designed to strip them of agency and identity. In this way, the legacy of Mamluk oppression is not solely one of victimhood, but also one of resistance and survival, highlighting the agency of women even in the most constrained circumstances. The historical memory of Christian women under Mamluk rule also shapes modern interpretations of gender, power, and religious minority experiences. Scholars use these examples to explore the intersections of gender, religion, and authority, illustrating how systemic oppression can manifest in both overt and subtle ways. Women's experiences under Mamluk rule demonstrate that political power is not only exercised through armies and courts, but also through social and cultural mechanisms that regulate identity, behavior, and bodily autonomy. By examining these dynamics, historians and cultural analysts can better understand the long-term consequences of state policies on marginalized populations, including the ways in which trauma and resilience are transmitted across generations. In conclusion, the legacy of Mamluk rule on Christian women is multifaceted, encompassing immediate social disruption, cultural and religious erosion, and long-term historical memory. Abduction, enslavement, forced conversion, and systemic exploitation created profound vulnerabilities, while also eliciting acts of resistance, survival, and resilience. The impact of these policies extended beyond individual women to shape communities, gender norms, and historical narratives. Contemporary scholarship continues to recover and interpret these experiences, shedding light on the human cost of a society celebrated for its military and architectural achievements, yet marked by coercion and exploitation. Ultimately, the legacy and historical memory of Mamluk oppression remind us that the exercise of power is never neutral. Christian women were targeted precisely because they represented both the body and the identity of the conquered, and their experiences illustrate how gender, religion, and authority intersect to shape historical outcomes. Their stories are essential for understanding the full scope of Mamluk rule, the lived reality of minority populations, and the enduring human consequences of systemic oppression. By remembering and studying these women, historians honor not only their suffering but also their resilience, ensuring that the lessons of this period remain relevant for both scholarship and collective memory.